Okay, so we're looking at the letters, and many of the principles, apart from the poetic stuff, apply to the letters. So the things that we've already learned apply to the letters, and I'm just going to present it in a different way, a fresh way, which hopefully makes it easier to understand and maybe remember. There's so many different ways to think about how you interpret things, text, and of course that applies to the Bible. So we're just going to look at a particular simple one that I came up with. I've just come up with this one, so if it's bad, it's my fault. I haven't copied it from anyone else, but the idea is just basic, standard interpretation. And the letters, of course, are Romans through Jude. We don't classify Revelation as a letter, even though it has letters in it. Overall, it's not a letter. So where are the letters from? The letters come from this world, from this part of the world. They were written from Rome and from Antioch, possibly, from Ephesus and Thessalonica and all these sort of places, and they were written to all these places, Ephesians and Colossians and Corinthians and Thessalonians and Philippians. There's letters that James wrote that were sent to the Jews that might have been sent to churches around here. The Paul wrote to the Romans as well as writing from Rome. So it's this part of the world that the letters are related to. And the time period is from about AD 40 or so, maybe a little later, AD 50 perhaps, to AD about 65.
So a ripper of a map really brings the book of Acts to life, doesn't it?
Yeah. This is from the ESV Study Bible, I think. It's the ESV Study Bible, which is there. A physical copy is there. Is an excellent, if you're going to get a study Bible, that would be my recommendation. But there are other good ones, like the NIV Study Bible. So we'll be using that later. Now, I thought I wanted a way to represent the diversity of the letters. So this is all of the letters. When there's two to a place, they're combined. So we just have Corinthians, not 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and just Thessalonians, not 1st and 2nd, and just Timothy, not 1st and 2nd, and same with John and Peter. And they're in that order, in the order that they are in the Bible. So Romans, Corinthians, etc. This is who the recipients are. That's a big feature of the letter. Who is it written to? And you can see I've categorized it into 3 different types of recipient. Churches of the city, or cities. So Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, they're all the cities, the citizens of the cities, the churches of the cities. And the way that it reads, the way the letters read, it's as if there's only one church per city back then. Then there's letters that are written. So all of the first letters, right up until Thessalonians in your Bible, in your New Testament, are written to churches in cities. So to the whole church. Then after that, there's these personal letters. That's what we call, most of them we call the pastoral letters, but Philemon is in there as well because it was written to an individual, but it's not a pastoral letter. But Timothy and Titus are both pastoral letters, so they're written to pastors from a pastoral perspective. And these ones are actually written to groups. So they tend to be called, Hebrews is named after the group that it's written to, and the rest are named after their authors, not after their recipients, because they're written to a general group.
So can I
I'm a bit lost here. What's the difference to writing to the Galatians from Galatia to writing to the Hebrews from...
Well, Galatia, when you write to a church in Galatia, what are you going to write about? What's the context of your letter going to be? If you write to, for example, if you wrote to Bow Desert Baptist, right? Would that be a different type of letter to one that you wrote to Rose, or one that you wrote to, retirees in Australia or something like that? So they're the sorts of categories that we're talking about. So the recipient actually makes for a different type of letter, because the cities, they're going to be talking about specific problems that those people were dealing with at that time. The people, they're going to be giving them personal advice. And you see that in Timothy, take a little bit of wine for your stomach. He can't say that to the Galatians or the Corinthians or something. Yeah, he actually says, don't take any wine for your stomach. You're taking too much wine for your stomach. And then these general ones, the deliberately circular letters, are much more general. So you get something like James or Hebrews, and they're much more general. They're not addressing a specific problem. Yeah. But an interesting feature of the New Testament letters is that all of them are actually written to be handed on to other people. So even the ones that are written to individuals, they're written with the idea in mind that other people are going to benefit from this. So Paul is addressing, in Timothy's case, Paul is addressing specific issues that Timothy needs to worry about, but he's making sure that he's doing it in a way that allows Timothy to say, hey, Paul sent me this great letter, you should have a read of it. And that's exactly what we're doing. Fortunately, they were written that way because that makes them useful to us. So there are some features in the letters, and we'll see that. We'll see that when we look at the structure of the letters. There's some features that make them very much a part of their time, like their greetings and especially their closings, where Paul often mentions specific people and he gives specific little personal notes. And they indicate to us that they actually are letters. They're not tracts. So they're actual letters, and that's been preserved down through the ages.
What did you say about the group letters before that? Were they general? Kind of, you had
these group
cities
ones.
Were the cities had specific issues for the churches within the city.
Yep.
The pastoral letters were written so they could. The group ones were just general.
The group ones do one of two things. Well, mostly the group letters, because they're general, they tend to have a theme that the writer is coming from a concern for a particular theme. And so Hebrews talks about faith and preserving the faith and that sort of thing. And James is also about faith, but from a very different perspective, the practicalities of faith. And Peter is about First Peter is about end times and enduring through persecution and stuff like that. So I'm just going off the top of my head here, so excuse me if I get anything wrong. But it's like the writer has something that they want to share with the Christian diaspora, and so they write that letter, rather than there's a specific issue that this church is wrestling with or this person is wrestling with. Another way to divide up church letters is by, of course, the author. And the author has a big difference too, because different authors approach things in different ways and they use different language. So when we're reading the letter, it's important to remember who the author is so that we can understand it better. Paul uses language in certain ways. James in another way, John in another way, Peter and so forth, and Jude. And we don't know who wrote Hebrews. Many people speculate Paul, but the language is a little bit different at times, and so they're not sure. But we have to be careful with that. Paul is a human being, so he doesn't have to be 100% consistent. He's not a robot. He's not Google. He's not some AI that's trained in a certain way. He's a creative human being whose theology develops over time. So if you read Galatians, his first letter, Galatians expresses things in subtly different ways to something like Colossians, which is one of his later letters. But all the same, there's a commonality there, and you can recognize his writing, and it's helpful to understand the same hand penned these different books. And something like Jude is such an outlier. Jude, in fact, was not. It's one of the disputed books in the canon. Disputed in the sense that it had a little bit of a debate around it. It got into the canon, so it's not like Tobit or something like that. It's a part of the canon of the New Testament, but it was one of those books that wasn't just an automatic shoe-in. So when you read Jude, you'll see some weird stuff in there. It refers to some of the apocryphal Old Testament books and stuff like that. Come on in.
I just figure out where to sit.
Yeah. There's one seat over there.
Or you can sit behind Mary here. You go with this.
Sorry, keep going.
Keep going. I'm sorry, Ruth.
Okay, so so we've looked at the recipients, the author, the dates. The dates have an impact, but not as big as we might think. They're more related to the progression of the author's thought. But it's not like in the Old Testament where there was a huge difference historically between the Old Testament books. The New Testament books are all in more or less the same milieu. The only differences that you note are that some of the books have a little bit more concern about persecution, like Peter, and than others, because at this time persecution was sporadic, and so there were outbreaks of persecution. And so if the letter was written in that context, then it would address it. In fact, you see that even in the letters in Revelation. They're all written at the same time, but the different letters have different concerns based upon, and that was just to churches in Turkey. So it's a very, very small range of geography and time in the letters to Revelation, but you can see the different realities that the church has faced. So another helpful thing to know about letters is the basic structure that they have, and they all have this basic skeleton. It's moved around a little bit, but it all has most of these elements. All of the letters have most of these elements, and usually in more or less this order. So the first one is salutation. This is how letters were written in the ancient times. So the contemporary letters that we come across have the same form of salutation, sometimes even the same phrases, and Christians have imbued them with their own meaning and added to them. So the salutation, for example, this gives you examples from Ephesians. The salutation has the sender, like we have, if we write a business letter, we have the sender up the top, and then the recipient, so the recipient, and then dear so-and-so, the greeting. So very, very familiar to us, but it's not formatted like that, obviously, in a Greek letter. It's just written out, and that's how it is in the Bible as well. And they're much nicer than ours too. They don't have boring addresses and postcodes and stuff. Much more poetic. And then after that, it's usually only a couple of verses. After that, there's a thanksgiving, and it's just an expression of joy and thanksgiving to God and setting the tone for a good Christian letter. That would be a good practice for us to copy, I think, in our letters. If we did that, we should do that in our newsletter, right?
And you'd have to come personally and read it.
Sorry?
You have to come to our place personally and read it.
No, I'll send somebody to carry the letter. Then there's the body, and this is where the meat is. So often in Paul's letters, such as Ephesians, this is the theological meat. You know, it's like, let's get stuck in and talk about Jesus and how he works and all this sort of stuff. And then what falls out of that is a bunch of commands or exhortations. This is how you should live. This is, given all of that stuff, this is how things should go. And in Paul's, almost all of Paul's letters follow this structure. The pastoral letters, though, flip the body and the commands. So Paul starts the pastoral letters with, this is called a paranesis or something. I didn't bother writing that word down because I knew you wouldn't remember it.
Exactly.
And so this part, the commands and exhortations, are actually up first in the pastoral letters, and then the theology that supports them follows that. Paul just can't not write theology, so he couldn't just say to Timothy, you know, do all of this stuff. He had to go into a bit of theology. But it's interesting.
Stuff because this.
Yeah, it's interesting that for the pastors it starts with this is what you got to do and here's why, whereas for the churches it's this is why and here's what you've got to do. And then finally there's the closing, and this is where you find all of the personal sort of stuff, you know. Oh, say good day to so-and-so, and oh, you know, give so-and-so a pat on the back for me, and I remember to tell so-and-so to do such and such, and tell them not to fight all so much.
So I notice sometimes you got like a doxology sometimes in the closing.
Yeah, the closing usually ends with something like a benediction, yeah, like a doxology or...
what do both of those things mean?
A doxology is
Like a blessing.
yeah, praise to God sort of thing, and doxos is
Praise.
praise.
Glory.
Yeah,
Yeah, we used to.
And-
Yeah, doxologies used to be, well, depending on which church you grew up in.
We'd sing it.
We used to, the churches we used to grow up in,
Yeah.
we used to either sing a doxology right at the very end, or one was said.
yeah. And a benediction is Benny is good and diction is word, so it's a good word that you end on. So it's like, you know, in church.
Jesus brought
Yeah,
back.
we used to sing it, remember?
Yeah,
And with
now
the,
unto him who
with
is
the
able to
threefold
keep.
amen at the end.
Praise God
Yeah.
from whom all blessings
Blessings
flow.
flow.
Yeah.
Praise
Lord.
You
You
believe.
and God.
Hold on, it goes now unto him who was able to keep you from falling.
So,
Yeah.
do you recognise
Yeah.
them?
No.
They're
like,
all-
I went to like a New Life when I was young, so which was called something else.
It's more the
Rabina
traditional
Uniting, probably.
church
Yeah.
do that.
It's
every
like
year.
Anglican-
Paradise
it's like
Rabina
men's
Uniting
church.
Church
No,
or something.
the
Uh-huh.
Uniting
Men's
Church used to
church
do
does
it.
too.
Yeah, they do a
Presbyterian.
benediction at the end.
That's cute.
Yeah,
Alright.
Presbyterian Methodist
Maybe we should
Uniting.
start doing that at Renew as a regular thing.
Well,
I'd
yeah,
love to have a
We-
blessing before we go.
when I end, I try to
I
do that.
sometimes remember doing. Often
But-
forget.
Yeah,
We need to start singing them again.
yeah, we could sing one occasionally. That would be good.
Not
That's
even
something
sing,
that-
'cause it gets
That's
a bit
something to suggest to Nicole.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm sure she'd
That's
like
just
that.
another thing for her to do. Come on.
I'm sure she'd like
Poor
it.
thing.
She'd like it. It's not that hard.
No. There's no music in it, and there's usually no music for the doxology.
No, you just.
You usually just sing
No,
it.
but you can sing a benediction together, and that's really cool. Like now unto him, or praise God from whom all blessings flow. They all have tunes.
That's what I remember.
Well, thank you. I don't know what those things are.
I grew up in the Uniting Church, and we did that. We had a liturgy.
Threefold
Did we do
amens.
that then?
Yeah,
I
the
don't think
amen,
so.
amen, amen. I love the threefold amen.
Amen.
Although I like the amen from Messiah, which is like 100-fold or something. But we can't really sing that at the end of the service. So, yeah, the letters actually end with blessings and doxologies and benedictions, which have influenced the liturgy of the church. So there is actually poetry in these letters. It's scattered through. There's little hymns in there. Philippians has the beautiful hymn about Jesus who being made human. No, how does it start? humbled himself and
being in the likeness,
being in the likeness of man.
Humbled himself and being made human.
Yeah.
We should know this, guys. Oh dear.
Yeah.
We're all having.
I should know that one off by heart, but that's often considered to be one of the earliest hymns of the Christian church.
So where was it?
Philippians chapter 2. It's beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. We should have songs that. I don't know why that isn't a song.
Someone
Well,
must
it
have
probably
done.
was, but because it's not a recent one, we don't sing it anymore.
Oh, yeah.
We sang a song from like '97 the other day.
That's
Yeah, that's
so
so
old.
long ago. My
Yeah,
goodness.
damn.
Four things.
That's 20 years ago. What do you mean? I wasn't even born when it came out.
We'll see Great Thou Art for you one day. That's pretty old too. That's 1700s, isn't it?
Or the original Amazing Grace. When was that?
Yeah,
That was
1700s as well.
We should sing that. Which is the medieval hymn? Anyway.
Oh yeah, we did it. Where it's Steve.
And be thou my
Yeah.
fortress.
Be
and
Be
thou
thou
my
my
vision.
Even older.
Yeah, that's a
That's
really
really
ancient
old.
hymn. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's medieval.
That's old.
that's
Yeah.
really old.
So, these things are older, of course. The letters are older. Now, how do you read them? That's a summary of them. That's elements that they have in common. But how do you then read them?
It's good to read in one go.
We're going to use an example text to work through. So that's what the worksheets have, and you'll see that this verse is bolded in your worksheet. But I've given you a bit of context.
It's on here.
And in the CEV, which I think is the translation that I've given you there,
We'll share.
the verse says, "Slaves, you must always obey your earthly masters." This verse has been used for various things down through the ages, including supporting slavery in the US. And so it's interesting to use this verse to see what it actually says. Okay? This is actually only part of a verse too. In other translations, that full stop is a comma, which makes it very obvious that this is not even an entire sentence. But in the CEV is designed to be very, very easy to read and easy to hear, so it tends to break things into smaller sentences. Now, does anyone recognise that?
Like Hong Kong.
Mm. So, if a real estate agent had this, if this was your view, this was my view when I lived in Hong Kong for the first 2.5 years in Hong Kong. This was my view. It didn't always look that nice. Obviously, I chose a nice photo. If a real estate agent had an apartment with that view, how would they advertise that?
Stunning.
Waterfront
Waterfront
views.
city.
Glorious dream waterfront view.
City skyline view.
There's a famous phrase that actually only has one word in it.
Famous phrase.
Breathtaking.
No,
What is it?
Expensive.
it has one word, but it's repeated.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're saying.
You're a teacher.
Location.
Yeah, or position.
Position.
Oh,
Yeah.
Exactly.
And in marketing, people say, what do they say in marketing? It's another P word.
Persistence.
Oh, I can't
Philippians.
remember. Yeah, Philippians. pay. So, in real estate, you hear people talk about, real estate is all about. There's 3 things that you've got to look for when you're looking for a house: position, and position. Right? In interpreting the letters or any Bible passage, in fact, there's 3 things that you've got to worry about. If I can get context, and context. Okay. Now, this might give you a hint that there's 3 sort of layers of context that we're going to talk about. Or you might think that we're going to watch a Looney Tune, but
That's true.
so the first context, the first layer of context is the context, in this case, of the letter or the book context. So the question that we ask in this layer is, where is this in the Bible? What's the biblical context? Where does this book fall in the Bible? Now, for the letters, they're all in a range, but where are they in the letters? Remember, we looked at I don't know if you noticed, but those divisions that I gave of recipient and author, the letters were sorted by recipient and author. So the compilers of the Bible have actually sorted the letters for you. So it actually makes it easy just by knowing where the letter is. You automatically know who the author is and what sort of recipient they are. So that makes it easy for you.
Is it done from like youngest letter to oldest letter, or something?
No,
like
it's not, because Romans is definitely not the youngest.
Romans is much later. The earliest is Galatians, I think.
Within those categories, it's sort of random. I don't know why they did them in the order that they gave them.
Length maybe. Take it shorter. You go
Yeah, but it isn't. So, because Galatians, I think, is shorter than Corinthians. Corinthians is. Yeah. Well, no, it's Romans, then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. The Philippians is shorter than Colossians, right?
So how do you do A-E-I-O?
So Galatians got G-A, Ephesians, E-I, Philippians, O is Colossians, and U, there is one. Isn't one. It's alright, it's just something, you know how you had to learn your Bible, the order, that's the one way I learned how to do it.
Yeah, I don't know. There's lots of different ways, like Roman Catholics go eat popcorn or something like that. Romans, then Colossians, Corinthians, then Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians.
Hey Malcolm, it's 8:15.
Oh, yep, better get a move on. Then the next thing to know about where the book is historical, right? So the historical context. When was it written? Remember I said that the range was fairly small, but it still makes a difference. So Galatians is very early, so its theology is early, and a big concern of Galatians is the way that Jesus has done the work for us, and we don't need to work our way to salvation. So that contrast between works and grace, and that was still being worked out at the time that Galatians was written. So that helps you understand that. As an example, who wrote it? We talked about that. Who was it written to? We talked about that. What was happening at the time? So what was happening in that church or in that person's life, if it's an individual recipient, or in the church in general. In fact, it's important to know what happened in the church in general for all of the letters. What was the situation in terms of the Jews versus the Gentiles? What was the situation in terms of law versus grace, etc.? And what was happening in society in general? Was there persecution? Were Christians considered part of Judaism? Were they considered a separate cult? Were they favoured or disfavoured? And then there's the logical context. So this is talking about the content. What was it written for? So what was the purpose of it? And what's its structure? So is it body then commands, or commands then body? Does it have both of those, etc.? The structure that we looked at before, how does that work? So now let's do a quick workshop. To find a book's context, there's some excellent tools. You can use an introduction. Now, an introduction is a book that just contains introductions to the books of the Bible. Commentaries usually contain an introduction, and the introduction tells you all that stuff that I just mentioned and a little bit more. But these books just have introductions. And this one is excellent. It's a really, really good introduction to the New Testament books. I've got it. It's written.
Literally called
It's in your list of resources. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's called Introduction to the New Testament, so it's not a very imaginative title. But it's Carson and Moo, which I think is a cool,
But
cool
actually,
collection
most of
authors.
the Bibles, even the ones on your phone,
Yep.
there is an introduction before all the books anyway.
Yep, I'm getting to that.
Okay, that's what you read.
There's also commentaries have introductions. The Tyndale commentaries are nice little commentaries that are easy to read. I wouldn't recommend you go and buy a word commentary, a word biblical commentary, for example, because it'll
painful.
just bog you down. But the Tyndale commentaries are very readable, and their introductions are quite helpful. So N.T. Wright has written the one on Colossians and Philemon. You might wonder why Colossians and Philemon, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And there's also, actually, if you want to know a commentary, if you want to know a cool commentary to buy for a book, good website, bestcommentaries.com, and you just go NT book, choose the book, or Alt books. This is the coolest website. I use this all the time, and it's got commentaries ranked by crowdsourced people, but it suits evangelicals. It's from an evangelical perspective. So, and they'll have reviews. They have reviews, so you can read the reviews and see what people say about the commentary. This one's like number 3 or 4 for Colossians, I think. And then, of course, there's study Bibles, which Sasha mentioned. The ESV, the NIV, the Faith Life Study Bible. These have introductions at the beginning of each book, and the ESV actually has quite a good introduction. So does the NIV, not as good. The ESV Study Bible is excellent in this area. It has really good introductions, as good as some commentaries. So that's where I would start if I was you, with the Study Bible. And the Faith Life Study Bible comes for free when you install your Faith Life Bible Study app. So you don't even have to pay money for that one. But its introduction is a little lightweight. So what we're going to do, I've printed out things and I've got physical copies of these things. So we're going to fill in this table for Colossians.
For Colossians.
Yep, because we're looking at that Colossians verse.